So welcome to our event series of the Claims Conference with the name Zachor. Zachor means in Hebrew to remember. And with this event series, we want on one hand to remember the Shoah, and on the other hand, we want to see what kind of impact the Shoah at this time had on different societies and have on different societies today. Today, the focus is Lithuania, but not only that. Until 1941, it has a vibrant Jewish community. And Vilnius was called at the time the Jerusalem of the North. Today, I'm talking with Dovid Katz. He was for many years living in Lithuania, and he knows the situation there very, very well. He is also a founder or creator of the platform Defending History. Dovid, why did you feel the necessity to create the platform calling Defending History? And I assume that you mean defending history, defending the history also of the Shoah.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Rudy. It's a pleasure to be talking to you. As you can hear, I'm from Brooklyn, New York originally, not from Lithuania. But in 1999, I relocated to Vilnius for 21 years. My main focus was and is the Yiddish language, to tape the last Yiddish of the last Holocaust survivors. But of course, while there, I learned very much about the Holocaust and the people I was interviewing. I learned, for example, that the image I had of those 600 years of tolerance and of a grand Litvak, it's called, civilization arising, and Lithuania having one of the best records of tolerance of anywhere in Eastern Europe, was absolutely accurate, well remembered in the collective memory of everyone. Then I learned that in their minds, the Holocaust started on June 23rd, 1941, a day after the launch of Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, when local armed young men, young militias with white armbands started to murder, to pillage, to humiliate, mostly younger women and older rabbinic men. Many atrocities for young women, teenagers were cut in half in this town center of Shaulė in Western Lithuania. Rabbi Zalman Osovsky's head was cut off in Kovna. All these things happened, and thousands were killed for several days before the Germans arrived or before the Nazis set up their own administration. So I had this history of the survivors, whom I became very close to during these thousands of interviews. Still, I was a happy professor of Yiddish, minding my own business publicly, until 2008, when two of my best friends, women in their 80s, Holocaust survivors, both from the Vilna ghetto, were being pursued by the police as war criminals because they had escaped the ghetto to join up with the Soviet partisans fighting Hitler. It was then I understood that this is the tip of the iceberg, that I had stumbled upon a vast program to rewrite the history of the Holocaust. And in a place where other people are not speaking up, I was taught from the Talmud at a very young age, you have to speak up, whatever the consequences. So in 2000,
and we are talking about tolerance, that it was a very long period of tolerance, 600 years of tolerance. Why do you think, or from the talks that you had with the survivors, why suddenly did the Lithuanian not even wait for the Germans to come in, but started to kill Jews?
I have been to many academic conferences and read many academic books where the explanation is given that this was the brilliantly evil propaganda coming out of Berlin, where the LAF, the Lithuanian Activist Front, was founded by Kazys Škirpa, a Lithuanian diplomat then in Berlin, and that a mass hysteria was created. I personally don't buy it, and the thousands of people I interviewed over, it's almost 30 years now, because I started in 1990 when I first visited Lithuania, we don't understand how it happened. The explanation is no explanation, because one of the ironies is that the Jewish communists didn't get killed. They fled with the fleeing Soviet forces. That's why those who came back in 44, 45, 46 tended to be pro-communist. The murders were of women, of babies, of old rabbis. There is no rational explanation other than some deep philosophical pessimism about the evil of humanity and how easy a crowd, a mob is mobilized. Let me hasten to say that it was less than 1% of the Lithuanian population that was involved, but very few stood up against them. And today, the killers are being hailed as great freedom fighters against the Soviets. So I think
for many of us, it will be very important to understand why those killers from those times are now some kind of have some kind of historical important position and are heroes of Lithuania. Why is that the case? Could you please elaborate on that?
Well, there is such a thing as nationalism, as ultra-nationalism, as extreme nationalism, which likes to say that our country, our nation, our people is faultless, spotless, without blemishes. I guess there are people in all countries who feel that way. And so there are some who don't want to admit collaboration with Hitler, but even that doesn't explain why a country, a national budget, would go out of its way to pour millions into saying these people are heroes. One reason that has been given to me by my many Lithuanian friends is that, well, the nationalists didn't like the narrative that after Lithuania was created in 1918 by Russia and Germany conspiring against Poland that year, that the Lithuanians then walked away from Vilna, their medieval capital, and it became part of Poland until the Second World War. That they were embarrassed that in 1939 and 1940, when the Soviets were doing their tricks of pretending to leave Lithuania independent, and in 1940 made it a Soviet republic, not a shot was fired. Where were all the Lithuanian patriots in 1940 that simply gave their country to the Soviets without a fight? So the nationalist historians came up with a narrative that in 1941, on June 23rd, the great uprising of the Lithuanian people occurred that drove out the Soviet army and proclaimed independence. Now, of course, that's total nonsense. The Soviets were fleeing Hitler. They were fleeing Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history that started one day before, on the 22nd of June. Moreover, how can you be a rebel when you don't fire a single shot against the authority when they're in power, and you start killing your Jewish neighbors when that authority is fleeing another power? In other words, it's total nonsense. But because it's in the EU, it's part of NATO, the West understands the current danger posed by Putin and Putinism. All this geopolitics and the massive campaign of propaganda has led this to be overlooked. So we are coming, as you said, Rudy, to June 22nd, June 23rd, 2021, the 80th anniversary of the launch of Barbarossa, which for all these countries is the start of the Holocaust, the start of the genocide. There was no Holocaust or genocide before that date. And it's being celebrated as a day of rebellion and independence and patriotism. So this is a huge scandal for ethics, for truth, and frankly, it's part of the new Holocaust denial. The new Holocaust denial, unlike the last century's Holocaust denial, doesn't say that these murders didn't occur. It agrees that they all occurred. It simply says it was the lesser of two genocides, that the Soviets were the main committers of genocide. After all, Stalin's regime abused people for many decades, and you can argue they had a larger number of victims. So there were two genocides, a complicated time, everybody was killing everyone, and the Holocaust is lost as a unique event without denying a single death. And if you add into this toxic mix now the geopolitics, that anything that praises anything that Russia or the Soviet Union ever did is considered taboo, even those years of alliance against Hitler, and then you add a massive budget for Jewish studies and Yiddish and conferences and junkets and grants, and you have many Jewish fellow travelers, or Nochschleppers, as we call them in Yiddish. Suddenly, the simple truth becomes something hard to defend. So our little group, we're a few dozen people around the world, about 20 in Lithuania, around the Defending History publication, we are determined to hold this little fort and defend this history.
So what is the platform doing? What is Defending History doing on the ground in Lithuania?
Very little on the ground other than reporting on what happens, on the truth, and putting it into the permanent record. That's all we can do. We don't have the wherewithal, the funding, to do any more. I'll give you an example. We're coming up to this 80th anniversary. On the eve of this event, the Parliament of Lithuania appointed as the new director of the state's Genocide Center a historian who 1 year ago, on the 23rd of June, gave his far-right lecture flanked by posters of two major Holocaust collaborators, Škirpa and Noreika. In other words, someone who himself has been one of the glorifiers of these people as great historic heroes of their nation, is now the head of the center that is in charge of research of the Holocaust, or as they put it, of genocide. So this isn't about the Lithuanian people, it's about the government policy that invests a fortune in distorting and obfuscating the Holocaust in order to sell the new theory of two genocides, double genocide as we call it, in which the Holocaust fades away as one of various or many equal or near equal events.
I mean, it's shocking that there is this kind of leveling in on such a high, let's say, administrative and political level. Do you see this only a special event for Lithuania, or do you see this especially for Lithuania, or do you see all those kind of developments also in other Eastern European countries?
It's in a number of East European countries. For example, the parliaments of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Hungary, Ukraine, all legislated new definitions of genocide that would include all Soviet crimes. So deportation, destruction of the intellectual class of dissidents has been defined by law as genocide. So there's a whole bunch of countries in Eastern Europe, all of them pro-Western and anti-Russian, anti-Soviet. In a way, the most extreme case is actually Ukraine, where there are statues and streets going up to honor Stepan Bandera and other horrific collaborators and perpetrators of the Holocaust and its crimes. but they're in a desperate fight with Russia for independence, for freedom, and it's very awkward to criticize anything they do, and the West is very loath to do that. Lithuania became the laboratory and also the main center for this phenomenon. One reason, Lithuania and the name Lithuania, Lita, Jerusalem of Lithuania that you alluded to, has a great civilization of 600-700 years behind it, the Gaon of Vilna, the great Litvak heritage that enabled a lot of this to be covered over with a simultaneous investment in we love the Litvak heritage. We're going to have another conference about the Gaon of Vilna. We're going to have another Yiddish festival. We're going to have this and that. So Lithuania pioneered. Lithuania has had a Jewish member of parliament who was himself a signatory to the Prague Declaration, which has been the declaration of double genocide, where this movement reached its peak. And it's hardly known even in the West. In June 2008, the Prague Declaration came out saying that all of Europe must regard Nazi and Soviet crimes as equal, that the textbooks in all European countries must be overhauled so that children are taught about them equally, that the victims must be recognized equally. Now that sounded very nice until I found out that someone deported to Siberia who came back and was one of 1% of his town deported is the same as 100% of the Jews in that town having been murdered in 1941. In other words, they're not the same. So this document that was largely encouraged by the Lithuanian parliament, by a special state commission, and the Lithuanian forces behind this, including a number of Jews who are very nationalist Lithuanians, they came up with the very clever idea to invest in Holocaust studies itself under this new umbrella. So American and Israeli scholars are lavishly welcomed to conferences with grants, with banquets, with photo ops in parliament. And I was shocked when the leader of the main Yiddish Institute, Yivo, sold out to double genocide and himself became a member of the State Commission on Nazi and Soviet Crimes. That was hard for me to believe, having founded Yiddish studies in Vilnius and then being removed from my university position in consort with my former colleagues in America who became addicted to these trips to Lithuania. So yes, this is a campaign to change history at a very dangerous time for Holocaust history. First of all, we are losing the last witnesses, survivors, even perpetrators. It's fading. People who saw anything themselves are disappearing from the planet by the limits of the human lifespan. Secondly, Putinism and Putinist Russia has reared its ugly head in such an autocratic, aggressive way that many people are loath, they are hesitant to criticize anything in the countries on Russia's periphery that are threatened by Russia. And that in turn mixes into the actual history. Let me give you an example. Of the thousands of people I interviewed in the 3 decades since I first visited Vilnius in 1990, all of them hated communism and Stalinism and had suffered terrible things from Stalinism, but they all believed that it was the Soviet resistance to Hitler from 41 to 44 in Lithuania and the surrounding countries that is the reason they and any of their families survived. That it was only the Soviets fighting Hitler. So the local Jews have a very different historic narrative in their families than the state's narrative. They remember their own grandparents who were Soviet Army veterans, proud of their medals. We are in a moment in history when it's become very easy to write the Holocaust as such out of history without denying a single death. And this is happening before our eyes.
Thank you, Dovid, to get so much in the depth of of what is happening in Lithuania, and also showing that this is kind of a start, that and that the development of it is also worrisome. Is there, in your opinion, is there a way to commemorate the Holocaust on the one thing, the situation at the time about the Soviet Union in Lithuania, but not as leveling on the same side as leveling? Is there a way? What would you say?
Thank you. That's a terrific question. There's a very easy way, and that is to commemorate Soviet crimes separately. There should be much more education in the West about Soviet crimes. There should be museums about Stalinist and Soviet crimes. That is completely accurate and important as an issue completely separate from the Holocaust. That's one very important thing we all need to do. A second thing we need to do is how we ourselves understand Holocaust history. For many reasons, June 22nd, June 23rd, June 1941 was the start of the genocidal phase of the Holocaust altogether. Before that, there were all kinds of plans, Madagascar, Deep Russia, Palestine, all kinds of plans. And then from Barbarossa, when local people quickly participated in the butchering of 1 million Jews in the remaining months of that year, that, of course, led to the Wannsee Conference final solution in January 42. So we need to understand that June 22nd, June 23rd is a major, major date in Holocaust history. Number one, it's the outbreak of the genocide, of the genocidal phase, where men, women, children, entire towns butchered for being Jews, not several, some being sent to camps, being used for labor, and so on. So it's the start of the genocide of the Holocaust. And then second, as unpalatable as it might be, that from June 41 until the end, in the countries where the mass of Jews lived in Eastern Europe, it was indeed only the Soviet Union. Now, this Soviet Union, we have to understand, the Red Army that liberated Lithuania in 44, it was not a Russian army. There were many Jews, there were many Ukrainians, there were many Lithuanians. In other words, the Soviet forces that defeated Hitler are part of the great Western success of stopping Hitler. And that cannot be taken away. That is also part of the history. History isn't all what's convenient to today. And so recognizing that in Lithuania, 96.4% of Jews were murdered in the Shoah. That's the highest percentage of any larger Jewish community. Now, this huge rate, the question then becomes a very awkward one. How did any Jew survive in such an environment of total genocide? And the answer I have been given by every survivor I spoke to, and I have these thousands of hours of tape, is that one way or another, they're alive because of the Soviets. How? The vast majority were flight survivors who fled eastward to Soviet-held territory the first few days. So many of my interviews are all about June 23rd, June 24th, June 25th, when so-and-so fled eastward into Russia and was treated like everyone else in Russia and tried to join the Red Army to come back and liberate their homeland. So that was the main way that the Soviet Union was the only way a Jew could be saved. The other ways are escaping the ghetto to join up with the Soviet-sponsored partisans in the forests of Eastern Europe, or the tiny, tiny percent that were rescued by the real Lithuanian heroes of World War II, the ones who risked everything to hide a Jewish neighbor, many of them simple peasants with no education. They are the heroes of June 22nd and the months and years that followed. But such a person, many of them were killed, and the Jews they were hiding were killed. But those that survived because they made it to the summer of 44 when the Soviets got there. So let me put it this way. Every person with a decent heart prayed for a Soviet victory against the Nazis, because the only other thing to pray for was a Nazi victory against the Soviets in that part of the world. We in the West tend to forget that there were no American or British or other Allied forces anywhere near where the bulk of the Holocaust took place, in the depths of Eastern Europe.
So you raised a point, a very important point about surviving, and it was surviving with the help of righteous Gentiles. And just wanted to point out two things: is that the Claims Conference is paying a rent to Righteous Gentiles today, and not only today, but already has this program for many, many, many years. And the second...
wonderful work, wonderful.
Thank you. And the second, that's more a question that I would like to put to you, is how are the Righteous Gentiles being commemorated regarding to the war crime heroes in question marks?
That's a fascinating question. And coming from Brooklyn, I have to give you the straight answer, which is a bit awkward, but it's the true answer as I see it from my 30 years of coming to Lithuania and my 21 years of living there. In short, when international Jewish organizations or tourist groups come, they find all kinds of events honoring the righteous Gentiles or the rescuers, Tzadike Umis Ho'elam in Lithuanian Yiddish. However, in the mainstream historiography, they are regarded as traitors who betrayed the Lithuanian activist front and the provisional government and were dreaming of a Soviet victory, which they were. Can't take that away, against these so-called nationalist heroes. Many of the Righteous Gentiles were murdered after the war by the Forest Brothers, the anti-Soviet guerrillas of the post-war period. It's a different issue, but the issues tie up when it comes to this. So when Western bigwigs, Jewish bigwigs come to visit, sure, there'll be a ceremony to give a medal to a Righteous Gentile or to his or her family. But within Lithuanian society, it was very difficult to get a plaque or a street name to honor any of them. There are street names for Noreika, for Škirpa, for Ambrazavičius Brazaitis, for all kinds of Holocaust perpetrators. The first street name for a Righteous Gentile occurred a few years ago in Vilnius, not in the city center, and for someone whom it was politically easy to honor, a great librarian at Vilnius University. In short, there has been a little bit of forced honoring of the Righteous Gentiles, but they are looked down on by the nationalist mainstream.
Commemorated in a sense is, how is the Holocaust commemorated for what happened there? Is there a place? Is there some kind of a commemoration day, a special commemoration day, as you have mentioned about the 22nd of June? As we all know, survivors' population worldwide are dwindling down, and we all ask ourselves the question: how will we commemorate without having survivors around us in the near future? Is there a certain perspective that you would to add from your experience and from your time in Lithuania on how that should be done?
Well, many survivors who I've spoken to over the last 30 years have spoken about that very openly. They were not young even in the 90s when I started, and they said to me, Dovid, we will soon be gone. And I would ask them, how do you want the generations after us to remember all this? The first answer is that they need to have the courage to tell the truth. In Lithuania, the truth is that local Nazis and fascists started the genocide and that we must protest these criminals being glorified as some kind of heroes against the Soviet Union, that we must have the courage that they had to express their true opinion, even if it might make somebody else uncomfortable. That's number one. Number two, they were all adamant that June 23rd is the day they wanted remembered as the day when the hundreds of years of peace came to an end and the beginnings of a dehumanization that was never broken until the total genocide, the total murder began, that being June 23rd in their unanimous view. I speak from thousands of interviews and I've never heard a deviation from that opinion, no matter how different the opinions were on other things. Then about commemoration, many of those I interviewed were shtetl Jews. I would go from former shtetl to former shtetl looking for the very last Mohican. And I remember this was actually in Western Belarus rather than Lithuania. The last Jew of Amdor, Eli Goldfund, on his deathbed said to me, please write the following, that when we die, that every town in Lithuania and Belarus and Latvia will have some kind of plaque or memorial in the center of town, not out in the forest at the mass grave, but on the town square with two important things. One, what was the extent of the Jewish community in its accomplishments, its numbers, its age for hundreds of years before the Holocaust? And two, who participated in the Holocaust here? What happened here? Those two things need to be commemorated in the center of town. That was the wish I heard time and again.
And Dovid, of those commemoration sites in the center of towns do exist today in Lithuania?
There are close to zero that tell the truth about the Holocaust. One exception, for example, in the northwestern town of Žagar, because of the initiative of a local Lithuanian businessman driven by conscience, led some years ago to a plaque in the middle of town which stressed the tragic, massive participation of locals. So that was an act of great courage. In the small northeastern Lithuanian town of, in Yiddish, it's Malat, today Moletai, there's a very brave director of the local museum, Victoria Kazdiane. She has now proposed a memorial in the center of town that would actually have the words white armbander. That's the local word in all the local languages for these LAF nationalist patriots, murderers who started the Holocaust. They all put on a white armband. So to say that the Jews here were killed by white armbanders and the Nazi forces, that monument has not yet been put up, so it's a plan.
So we hope that in future times, many more of those monuments, much more of those monuments will be placed in Lithuania. So to go to another direction in this discussion, I would like to ask you that about the academic, the historian academic work that has been done in Lithuania. Do you have the feeling that you are free to publish, and is that something where you feel that academics are not dictated, but at least pressured from governmental institutions in Lithuania, or not? What is your take?
Thank you so much, Rudy. That is a very important question that I neglected to speak about. This is hard to appreciate in the West. Lithuania is a splendid democracy. You can stand outside the president's residence and say the president is an idiot. You are protected by freedom of speech laws of the Lithuanian Constitution and of the European Union. The only topic on which there is no freedom of speech is this topic of World War II, the Holocaust, the so-called revolt against the Soviet Union. Everyone who has ever spoken out has been fired, has had their career ruined never to work again, or has been made the victim of rumor, gossip, career, and personal destruction. I had an incident-free 11 wonderful year stretch as professor of Yiddish at Vilnius University. And when I published my first article on this topic, my own politics have all my life been so centrist that they've been boring to me. So, of course, it was a little funny to be called for, but I am not the issue. The issue is young Lithuanian scholars. Are they going to speak out if it's going to be the end of their careers? Of course not. They're going to emigrate, or they're going to do something else entirely, and the tiny, tiny remnant will stay to become the henchmen of the genocide complex, the double genocide complex that includes the Genocide Center, the Genocide Museum. So it's fascinating that in a country where freedom of speech is so real, that the one great exception is on this topic on the Holocaust. Anybody who dares say that these killers of June 23rd, 1941, and so on, and the remaining months and years were killers, is immediately called a Putinist agent. He's working for Russia. He's working for Putin. And in a country so under the threat of Russian expansionism, that's enough to kill any career. So nobody with a dissident view is employed in any academic or academic-related institution. And there are many experts on Hebrew, on Yiddish, on Jewish history who are employed. Part of their remit is to cover for this issue and to create events that will attract top Western scholars, Jewish scholars, so they won't talk about this.
And Dovid, last question. I see how difficult and really dark the situation is if it comes to the truth on the Holocaust. Have you seen also some positive aspects developing in the last years?
On this issue, no, because I have tragically seen the continued success of the revisionist movement. To give just a small example, I had mentioned before the Prague Declaration. One of its proposals is that August 23rd become the new international day to commemorate Nazi and Soviet crimes. Now, it doesn't say it, but one of the purposes is, of course, to diminish or do away with Holocaust Remembrance Day or Yom HaShoah, or both of them, because there's not going to be 2 days. There's going to be the new day, August 23rd, for Nazi and Soviet victims together. Would you believe that the political forces that are powerful today convinced both the American Congress and the Canadian Parliament to pass resolutions recognizing it? Of course, it was all sexed up as Black Ribbon Day. It's Black Ribbon Day when we commemorate the victims of Hitler and Stalin. That's just one example. In Britain, we prevented it from passing the parliament. But leaving that aside, I am, at the moment, I'm not the pessimist. I'm optimistic that conversations such as ours, Rudy, will inspire young, talented people with a future in the field to begin to speak up on the issue of 21st century Holocaust revisionism, denial, the double genocide theory, and to be careful of the trickery of commemorating the Holocaust in the context of the downgrade of the Holocaust as part of this fake new paradigm, part of which glorifies the perpetrators. It's so wild and So I'm optimistic that good things will happen, but they haven't yet on this question. From the 1990s, shortly after independence, when this double genocide was getting underway, part of the plan was to incorporate commemoration of the murder of the Jews, whatever you would call it, into the larger calendar of genocide. So the date for commemorating the Holocaust in Lithuania is September 23rd, which commemorates the liquidation of the Vilna Ghetto in 1943. I have never yet met a Lithuanian Jew who thought that was the appropriate date. Most of Lithuanian Jewry was butchered by the end of 1941. A few tens of thousands were kept alive in the ghettos. And then on what happened in September 43 was one of the many after effects, after narratives, when the ghettos were liquidated and the few who were not killed were sent to slave labor in the major concentration camps. The reason is that the ghettos were indeed run by the Germans, and it deflected attention away from the murder of the vast majority of Lithuanian Jews with massive Lithuanian initiative and participation in 1941. So the date itself is very problematic and faulty when the survivors and their families all remember June 23rd. Now, June 23rd, the day after Barbarossa started, Monday, June 23rd, 1941, was the day when the white arm-banded so-called patriots began to murder Jews, but it was also the day when the provisional government declared independence in Kaunas, independence from the Soviet Union, and swore allegiance to Adolf Hitler. So I fail to understand why a modern democracy would want to glorify that day or that event.
Dovid, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
It was a pleasure to discuss with you and to get very deep into the history and also the commemoration of today's in Lithuania. So I wish you very well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.